Go. Welcome to the Lightforge. This is ADWCTA.
This is Merps. Happy President's Day weekend. By the time you hear this tomorrow, which is, I guess, Monday, hopefully you guys have the day off to enjoy yourselves.
I mean, why are
And
we
if
still calling
not,
it President's Day? Why are we not just calling it Donald Trump Day? Because that's what it's going to be by the end of the year.
I,
It's
I
just going
think
to be
that's fair.
rebranded.
I think it will be rebranded. But until then, it is still just President's Day and President's Day weekend. So hopefully you guys are enjoying this on your day off. And if you're not, well, at least you're listening to the Lightforge, and hopefully we're providing that tiny bit of entertainment to get you through the day. But yes, we have a decent amount to talk about today. Starting with, I guess,
this is like ridiculously huge news.
Yeah.
But, like, to construct it, I feel like, okay, let's
still big. It's still
set
big.
this aside. Around this time, I think last year, this was like the standard announcement, right? Like for constructed, that the next set standard was going to be rotating in, right? That was the OG announcement for last year. Now we're getting the Year of the Mammoth kind of like announcement, which is a series of changes. So let's run down the changes first, because there's so many of them, and then we can kind of talk about it.
All right. So I'm just going to go through the big Year of the Mammoth news. And then if it relates to Arena, we'll talk about it a little bit. If it doesn't, whatever. First of all, set rotation is coming for constructed, so doesn't really do anything. What it does do, though, is because we've heard news that Arena will probably shift to standard at some point, right? That is the direction that Blizzard has basically stated they want to go towards, and to me, it makes sense. We had a huge conversation about this. We don't need to, keep on talking about it, but it seems like it's the direction that they want to go. And, we are going to see this core rotation. So, yeah, I mean, we could definitely see a lot of cards in the arena shifting out very soon, right?
Yeah, so to be specific, they didn't announce anything about the arena. They just announced the things generally. And we're just extrapolating that standard arena is coming at some point. I'm guessing with some of these changes, probably not in the next expansion. Maybe like in between the expansions, they'll shift it. But it's coming. So what exactly are the changes?
Right. So 3 sets will be rotating out. Gosh, what are the sets again?
Okay, well, it's going to be the one everyone forgot, which is Black Rock Mountain.
So there's Black Rock Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I like barely remember that thing exists.
Dude, Imp Gang Boss.
Oh yeah, that was the Imp Gang Boss introduction. That was when Warlock became like a real thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's that. There's TGT, which is the big one, right? That's the big expansion of that year. And then there's LOE, which has a lot of cards that everyone loves, like Keeper of Oldemon.
Keeper of Oldemon and Ethereal Conjurer was in that one, right?
Yeah, Ethereal Conjurer was in that one.
Ethereal Conjurer will be could potentially leave the arena as well. So lots of actual power cards from the top classes right now could be gone. But once again, this is a little bit too premature to heavily dig into it because we're still not sure. But we know it's definitely happening for constructed, and we've known this since last year. So that was totally to be expected. What was a little bit unexpected was they are creating a Hall of Fame. That's an interesting way of saying like purgatory.
Forced retirement.
Retirement, exactly. Hall of Fame, forced retirement for certain cards.
The farm upstate.
Yeah, it's like, Mommy, where did Azure Drake go? Azure Drake is in a good place now, dear.
It's a Hall of Fame for the best cards.
Dear Azure Drake is living with Grandma upstate now. So what happened was the developers looked at certain cards from the classic set, which is sort of the evergreen set, right? And they said, for purposes of future card balance and for just we want to sort of shake up the meta, so we are putting certain cards in the Hall of Fame, which means you can't play them in standard anymore.
They become wild. They are still part of the standards of like the classic set, but for like purposes of constructed and like whether they're wild or standard, they are wild.
Right. So let's go through the neutral cards first. It is Azure Drake, Sylvanas Windrunner.
And then Azure Drake is a huge one.
Azure Drake is a huge one. So it's Azure Drake, Sylvanas Windrunner, and Ragnaros the Fire Lord.
Yeah, we don't care about those other two.
Yeah, I mean, look, you are losing two top tier legendaries, right? Like two top tier legendaries, and they are very fun cards as well. But the big one, if we do move to a standard arena, the one that will lose is Azure Drake, which has been a premium or semi-premium rare since the game began, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember back in Classic, it used to be like the rare.
The best
It was
card, yeah. And
the best card ever.
I remember when we moved it to what I still think is its proper place, which is like Yeti-ish, like the uproar of people that are like, but Azure Drake is the best card ever, and it's really not in the arena these days. But it's still good, and really, it's
still definitely drafted.
It's not a problem in the arena, right?
No,
like so, it's gonna be one of those things where, and that's the thing with arena and going standard, right? That people have like general complaints about in the first place, which is that arena doesn't necessarily need this for balance purposes the way constructed does, right? Like if you don't have a rotation in constructed, you have a hugely unbalanced game. Like the combos get out of control, you can't print cards, it's bad. In arena, it just gets more complicated to like get into the game, right? The barrier of entry gets higher, the game gets more complex, arguably, but regardless, it's not like the end of the world. And so instead, all these like nice cards are no longer to be seen in the arena in the future whenever they do go to Wild. And here, this is my first objection. This is done with no arena considerations, and it shouldn't be, because it's about how they want constructed to look. That's what they're making these decisions. Right. And for the legendaries, it doesn't really affect arena. But like Azure Drake is a totally balanced, very well designed card for the arena, and has always been. Well, in the early going, it was a little too high value, but these days, it's just good. It's just a normal good card. No one's like, oh no, Azure Drake, and no one's like, yes, I have an Azure Drake, it's the best card ever. Or some people still do, but I think they're wrong. The point is, like, there's no point in taking it out of the arena. It's not a terribly difficult card. Like, you never play around it, right? So it doesn't really affect barrier of entry. It's a dragon that's good, and we need more good dragons to make these dragon synergies actually function in the arena. Like, it's not good to take Azure Drake out of the arena if they do it. It's actively bad. Like, the arena would be much better with Azure Drake for the fact that you need good dragons for the dragon synergies.
Yep. So, out of the three neutral cards, Azure Drake is the one that will be missed if there is a big change. And let's go to the class cards, which are going into the Hall of Fame. They are Power Overwhelming, Ice Lance, and Conceal. So.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Huge losses for arena if that happens.
Well, first of all, losing Conceal and losing Ice Lance makes Rogue and Mage better.
Yes,
right?
Yes, exactly. Yes. It's actually a buff to Rogue and Mage.
It's a buff to Rogue and Mage, and oh my gosh, losing PO, I think PO is such a good card for Warlock. It's so good. Like, the tempo play is ridiculous from something like Power Overwhelming. And especially because they have some synergies with it, right? Like Void Terror or Shadow Flame. Just stuff like that as well.
I mean, I know you're afraid of PO a lot, but I generally don't even play around PO. Like, I mean, we have not like terribly different philosophies on dealing with Warlock, but I just hit the Warlock's face. I almost never clear things on the board. Like, even with an M Gang Boss, I think half the time I would not clear it unless I have like a super clean kill on it. And it would, be not clean because I have like smaller minis on the board as well. But other than that, I just hit them to the face. And if they PO, they PO. It's not the end of the world, in my opinion. But for people who do like play Warlock against Warlock, like a somewhat normal class with like maybe additional emphasis on face, but generally you are still afraid of, Warlocks have buffs, right? They have Demon Fire. And Power Overwhelming goes on everything. And if you're clearing the Warlock, you can't be hitting its face. It has a health pool. The health pool is ridiculous for the Warlock in the late game in terms of game winning. So it's a huge loss because Power Overwhelming was the key punish in the arena for playing the way I play.
Yes. And now, like, I definitely agree. Like, lots of times, because it's unless you can clear everything and unless you can do it in a somewhat efficient manner. Like, if you're bumping like your 5 attack guy into his like 2/2 and you're missing 5 face damage, you better have a really, really freaking good reason for that. Otherwise, that's just a terrible play against a Warlock, right?
Yep. And you can, what if this change happens and it hits the arena? Demons are still, you still have to clear them, right? There's still a whole bunch
Sure.
of demon buffs.
Yep.
And I do take a little bit more priority on clearing demons. I oftentimes still don't even clear demons. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
but it gets, it becomes a more easy choice generally to hit face.
Oh, it changes the math
Yeah.
entirely, and especially like if they've been holding cards and
Hmm.
it, you can get a decent read on like a Shadow Flame, right? Like this is the card that sort of always pushes Shadow Flame over the top,
Yep.
right? It just
Yep.
increases the damage by so much. But the other two, so like if PO is gone from the arena, I think it definitely it's not just the card, it's the threat of the card, right? It's like the threat of Flame Strike makes you think about it a little bit more. The
Hmm.
threat
Yep.
of PO and the fact that it is always there as an actual card at the same time, changes the math against Warlocks and just increases those amount of times in which like sort of PO is the only card that brings them back into the game and they
Yep.
have it.
So again, this is one of those things where, okay, you could argue Warlock's a little overpowered right now and probably needs a tuning down, but like PO is not the card to remove. No one would go out and like remove PO. Or I hope they wouldn't from an arena perspective to remove PO. So
And plus, if Imp Gang Boss is gone, they lose tons of power.
right, yeah,
So
oh
much
that's
power.
true, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, again, these are it's like constructive driven changes that's affecting arena in a what I think will be a negative way, even if we go standard.
Yeah.
Okay, but well, okay. So that's stuff that may happen in the future. What about stuff that's definitely happening in like 2 weeks?
Stuff that's definitely happening in 2 weeks. You mean like the announcement of the next expansion?
I,
Is
I
that what you're
mean,
getting
I
at?
mean the
Or
nerfs that are happening to existing cards in this game. That's going to affect the arena in exactly in 2 weeks, because they announced
oh,
that the
okay.
patch is
So
happening at the end of the month.
that's not Year of the Mammoth stuff. I was thinking of talking about that afterwards. There's still one
Oh,
more Year of the Mammoth announcement.
wait, that's a
Um,
separate announcement that they just
I
made in the
know,
same week.
Uh, dude. So Team Five has been really good about sort of communication since the New Year's, right? I've been. I remember when we had our sort of New Year's podcast. I was like, "This is such a make or break year. We need better communication,"
Hmm.
and I think they've done a great job so far. Whether or not you agree with the gameplay decisions they've made, um, the amount of communication and sort of the number of announcements, I think you have to be happier, right? Significantly happier about that. It's just such a huge difference from
Yeah.
what happened all of last year. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go over Year of the Mammoth changes first, then.
Sure.
So
So
what's the
basically,
next
one
one?
last thing. So far we've sort of at the very beginning we saw that it was one of those like adventure big card expansion, adventure, big card expansion, right?
Yep.
And then we were expecting for this year it would change to sort of at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year there would be big expansions, and in the middle of the year it would be sandwiched by an adventure, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was wrong. So even that was wrong. What we're getting instead are three 130 card, approximately, they said approximately, three 130 card expansions in this year. So basically, you won't have that lull in the middle of the year where an adventure comes out and you don't have a huge change in the meta, right? So we're just going to get three big expansions during the year, entirely new meta, and yeah, I think most people are like really surprised at it. Some people have some critiques, but I think this is overall positive.
Oh
Like
yeah, it's great.
more content.
Yeah, it's just more content. Like, I was thinking that it was going to be a venture, big expansion adventure, the way it was 2 years ago, because they do the the one, and then the other one, and then the other kind of cycle.
Right,
And
right.
so for me, it's the equivalent of getting like one additional full large expansion in the year, because it turns two adventures into large expansions. It's gonna be great, especially for the arena, right?
Yeah.
Arena uses every card, so like getting more cards is just more fun arena. In constructed, who knows what those like whether those cards are usable or not or whatever. So it's not exactly the same, but for arena, literally just more cards, more different. The arena
Yep.
experience meta will change more differently in large expansions than the small ones, and that's great. Especially if they do the thing that they did with MSG and with TGT, but not with OG, which is, well, they did it with OG too, but it only affected constructed, which is to completely add a mechanic that changes the way you play the game. Right?
Yep.
Like the
Definitely.
hand buffs were, oh my god, that was huge, right? And then Inspire, that was ridiculous. So if they do that every expansion from now on, we're going to see like the levels of intellectual arena like adjustment and challenges that we had previously only seen once a year to happen
Yeah.
3 times a year. Like I can't emphasize how much better the arena. Like assuming these are balanced and actually fun and interesting and not like game breaking, right? Because doing more always runs the risk of like breaking the whole thing. So assuming that Blizzard does not break arena with these kinds of mechanics, getting them 3 times as often is amazing. And you know what? They haven't broken the arena. Like TGT got a little iffy. Like it wasn't very fun towards the end. Like in the beginning, it was like, "Ooh, this is interesting." The snowball mechanic, and then it was like, "Okay, everything just snowballs now." But if Blizzard can like release, and then I think Blizzard's gotten better. Like Team 5's gotten better at knowing what will have what kind of effects in their own game. So 3 times as often is incredible. Like I am really hyped now for this year when it comes to Hearthstone Arena. Even if they don't do anything like significant for the arena, just the fact that they're releasing 3 large expansions is ridiculous in terms of how much your arena diversity is going to increase, right? How much you'll be more invested in the game. Because I think everyone agrees MSG is the best meta ever. And it's just going to keep shifting. So I'm very excited about what's coming. And I'm hoping that my excitement will not be met with the disappointment of the next expansion coming out with no new mechanic whatsoever, and me just sitting there being like, oh, well, so much for that.
Yeah. So that's sort of all of the announcements for Year of the Mammoth, which I think is pretty good, right? A lot of changes coming out. Good stuff to look forward to, especially we should have the announcement of the expansion soon-ish, whatever that means. But let's go on to what you were addressing, which are 2 pretty important changes slash nerfs for Constructed. We'll definitely feel the effects in Arena as well. So let's go through that. There will be changes coming very soon. So probably around
the end of the month is what they say,
yeah, end of this month-ish.
Mm-hmm.
To 2 cards. First, Small Time Buccaneer, which is a neutral rare. It's a 1-mana 1/2 right
is it
now.
A rare? I thought it was a common.
No, it's a rare.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's a 1-mana 1/2 that gains 2 attack when you have a weapon equipped. So it'll be changing from the 1-mana 1/2 into a 1-mana 1/1. So ADWCTA, how does this affect the card in terms of like?
Okay, you're not taking
still draftable.
It was never draftable. It was only draftable in Rogue and like maybe Warrior. Warrior even had a big like fall off because it doesn't matter how big your weapon is. It just matters that you had a weapon in your hand.
I think it was more draftable for Shaman because of Jade Claws and Stormforge Axe, right?
Right, and like even Paladin, right? You have Muster for Battle, you have Light's Justice. But yeah, so it's one of those cards where it's gonna hurt. Like it will hurt the rogue, but for the rest of the classes, you really weren't drafting this card to begin with, and so it doesn't really matter. For the rogue, you just removed a card that was a premium card, and you've swapped it out with a card that is, I mean, just like not very good.
Yeah, it's a little bit. It's a little bit of a shame for Rogue, right? Because if you look at this card, it really is just a 1-mana. It used to be a 1-mana 3/2, which, and now it's a 1-mana 3/1, which is still good. And you, as Rogue, you still even draft 1-mana 2/1 sometimes, just for the hell of it.
Yeah.
So it's still okay, but obviously its score is going to go down a lot now that it can be pinged. It's susceptible to a lot of 1-damage AoEs as well.
It's not really. It was never a 1-mana 3/2. People like to say that, but that's like them saying it's like, oh, it's a 4-mana 7/7. It's not really a 4-mana 7/7. It's not really. There's a condition on it.
Sure.
You actually have to keep that weapon out. So that means you need to trade that 3/2. Like in the same way that Zombie Chow is a 1-mana 2/3, but you have to trade the Zombie Chow. You have to trade the Small Time Buccaneer, or you can't use the weapon and you just anti-tempoed on turn 2 for no good reason.
Right. Like, I mean, it does help that you have 2 charges.
Yeah. So you get, but still, you're only using half the tempo that you're supposed to use. Like you're missing 1 tempo in the early game. That's huge if you don't trade it. So it gives you the option to use it or not use it, but it was never a 1-mana 3/2, and that's why it's not a 1-mana 3/1 now. It's a 1-mana conditional 3/1, which yes, it's better than a 1-mana 2/1, maybe. Like
I think
later
it
on
is.
in the
Yeah.
game, do you even like you sometimes don't have a dagger in your hand, and if you don't, you can't even play this card out if your opponent has a board or anything like that. So, I think it gets a lot more conditional. Um,
Yes, it definitely does.
so it's going to not be a good card.
Right. And before it was like a sort of draft dependent card, like you said, for those other classes like
Hmm.
warrior, paladin, or shaman. You just never drafted it for the other class, and for rogue, it was a premium. So, that's going to be the effect. The next change is going to be spirit claws, which everything else stays the same. It is a 1/3 weapon, which gains 2 attack when you have spell damage. But now instead of 1 mana, they doubled it.
Yep.
So it's 2 mana now. Oh my gosh, that changes this so much.
I mean, it was always a stupid card. I'm kind of happy they nerfed it, but at the same time, it's a big loss for the shaman.
It's so huge. It basically makes it go from premium to I don't. Oh gosh, is it even an average card now?
Nah, well, it
Not.
depends because you always hate on like 1 damage weapons. I have them rated higher, and then on the tier list, you like move them down.
Yeah, I look, you
So
have access to it's just the way it worked as well because sometimes if you didn't, you always had that like BS 25% chance to win the game, right?
yeah,
Like just
yeah.
turn
That's
one
why
if
I
you turn
hate it. Otherwise, it's just like
Yeah.
a crappy Lights Justice, which is Lights Justice is an insane card. I take it above like pretty much everything else, above where our tier list has it. And this is basically this, even without the spell damage one. It's like fairly similar because you rarely use that fourth charge for the Lights Justice.
Yeah, yeah. But just the fact that you can't do turn one spirit claws into turn two um, totem, or for shaman, like Cabal Geomancer is not the worst pick, right?
Hmm.
Especially if you have one of these, but also a lot of spells and a lot of AoEs are at your disposal. So I draft Cabal Geomancers obviously higher than I do for other
Yep.
classes. And you could just do turn one spirit claws, turn two Cabal Geomancer, and you win the game.
Yep.
It's very simple. So going to 2 mana hurts this so much. I don't know if it's even an average card now ish, just because Shaman has access to quite a few other weapons actually, especially now, right? With Jade Claws.
I mean, Jade
So
Claws is rare. It's not.
it is.
Let's not oversell Jade Claws' availability in the arena.
No, that's fair. That's fair.
Uh,
But this is yet another 2 mana weapon,
yep.
right? Which is and obviously it's so much worse
So
than
bad,
their
yeah.
other and
Like,
then the other weapons.
to the extent that it could even be a okay card, just shows you how overpowered weapons are in the arena.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I think those are all the announcements, and yeah, Blizzard is definitely moving and shaking, right? And-
Hearthstone is happening, and I think I like it. I think they've moved on from their initial. They're like fully moved on from their initial stage. They were in transition last year from like expanding the casual base into like, oh, we actually have a game now. Let's actually like focus a bit more on like what our players are like doing actually. And I think they've made that transition last year, and now they've structured the game in a way in which it's really just more appealing for people who already play the game, and for new players, they just have to get back in and like and figure it out, kind of, right? So it's definitely more content for us. Like I think the biggest news is that we're getting a lot more cards. Like no one thinks that's the biggest news of this whole thing, but I think it's definitely the biggest news. It's 70 more cards than anyone expected. It's 140 more cards than they've been doing in past in the past year systems, and that's huge. That's just like additional content. Like imagine if your game got rather than like I don't know, the developers instead of doing like bi-monthly patches started doing monthly patches. Like you would be like, oh yeah, they're really focusing a lot on this game and it's really good. But this news seems to be like the way off to the side. That some like people are like, oh yeah, also they're changing the way they release new expansions. They're adding cards. We're just getting more cards.
More cards. Whether or not they're good or bad,
Doesn't
obviously
matter.
we have. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Doesn't
It will
matter.
change. We're gonna see like big shifts and big
Mhm.
changes in the meta every single time.
Because the
Just
arena
because,
meta is dependent
yeah,
on the number of cards that are offered and what they are. If you just offer a bunch of random 4/3s over 3/4s, for example, like in the current meta, big things have changed in the 3-drop meta. Like, and that was just 2 4/3s. That's all that was added. They didn't even take any 3/4s away. They just added 4/3s, 2 of them, and that's it.
Yep. And I mean, I never take 2/4s anymore, right? You can't take 2/4s.
Got so much worse.
Yeah. Well, unless it's like your favorite card, like Grime Street Smuggler.
Oh, that's such a good card. That's like because it has a free effect almost. It's not really free, but it's good.
Right. But because of like Hired Gun, you look at something like Illuminator or Goblin Sapper, which was really bad in the first place, but now you're just like, there's no way I can take this. There's just absolutely no way. Yeah.
Yep. And it's the worst part, I think, is that it's in the grimy goons, and the goons don't ping.
I know, right?
It's just so bad. Like, it's a poor fit for like the arena meta. But okay, that's enough about more Blizzard announcements. We actually spent a lot of time on it. But let's do a really quick deep fried meta. Deep fried meta is where we deep fried the meta, and we try to pick a small topic today because we had a lot of other stuff to talk about, and we don't want this to go too long. But I want to cover this really quickly because it really ties into what's going to come up next with the Abyssal Enforcer discussion. You know what? Let's do it after question from the GOAT. I'm going to switch the order up. We're going to do question from the GOAT, and then we're going to do deep fried meta with the card good bad.
Wow. Okay. All right. Changing it up. I see.
Yeah. Question from the GOAT. What is the question from the GOAT?
Question from the GOAT. This is a little bit late, but I think it's still cool to talk about. A couple months back, I think it's whatever. Anyways, some time ago, they changed the name of this game that we're talking about, if you didn't notice, from Hearthstone Heroes of Warcraft to just Hearthstone. And if you open up the game, you'll see it no longer says Hearthstone Heroes of Warcraft. It's just Hearthstone, which some people were saying, well, this definitely opens up the opportunity, if they wanted, to bring in other franchises or other IP, right? So I guess the question is sort of, do you think they'll ever do it? And if so, what do you think they should do with it, right?
Okay, so you say, like, if you didn't notice, I really didn't notice. Like, literally, you told me the question from the GOAT.
Of course you didn't.
Like 15 minutes before we started taping this Lightforge, and I was like, no, like really? They did that? I thought it always just said Hearthstone. Like my problem wasn't that I didn't think it just said Hearthstone now. I never realized it said Hearthstone Heroes of Warcraft, which is stupid because that's the name of the game. Okay, so here's the thing with the name change. I don't think it necessarily means that they're going to bring in other Blizzard IPs into this game. I think it's really more that when you launched Hearthstone, you needed to get people to play it, and Warcraft is such a huge IP that they wanted to say, like, hey, look, here's the next Warcraft game, kind of, sort of. Everybody go try it. And they have all these cross-promotions and all that. But by now, it's, like, very abundantly clear that Hearthstone is so much bigger than Warcraft. Hearthstone is, like, a giant. It stands by itself. And it's even like an alternate universe to like the Warcraft universe, right? It's like different like possibilities. You have Ragnaros the Light Lord, right? They're just telling their own stories at this point. So they're just divorcing themselves from the Warcraft tag. They don't need it anymore. And in fact, they want to look like they're an independent product. This is not a tag along game to Warcraft, where it's like the trading card game from World of Warcraft, right? Which at the beginning, if you're trying to sell the game, that's not a bad way to sell it. But given how the game is exploded, at this point, it's just Hearthstone. This is their IP. This is a whole IP. If they were to create Hearthstone 2, it would be Hearthstone 2. It would not be Hearthstone 2 Heroes of Warcraft again.
Heroes of Warcraft again.
So back to your question about like what I would like to see come in. I mean, I think the obvious one's StarCraft, right? That's the other universe that's like extremely rich with like stories and actual characters. Diablo's a little light on characters. I don't think they'll make like a new hero Necromancer, right? Like that's a little weird.
There's actually a lot of deep lore about Diablo and StarCraft to an extent. There's like books about all of their franchises, right? So there's actually deep history about all of their franchises.
Yeah, but it's like not really in the game. Like the game is so divorced from the actual lore. Like the lore in the game And this is what I did as soon as Diablo 3 came out. So Diablo 2, I obviously read every single passage. I did Diablo 1 as well. But Diablo 3, I actually completed the quest. It was one of the first quests I completed after I completed the game, which is to talk to everybody about everything. Like, get all the dialogues. There's an achievement for that. And I got it. And so I know exactly how much lore is in this actual game. And it is a shockingly, shockingly small amount. It's just not what the game is about, game-wise. I'm sure there's a whole story and a world and a story behind it and all that, but the game does not do a very good job of like making it terribly compelling. So
Yeah,
it also
I got you.
it lacks heroes. It lacks named heroes. That's such a big problem. Like I think initially it was probably not a problem back when they made the game and decided to do it that way. But these days, there's so much content that not having names to your heroes is kind of weird. They're just like generic classed heroes.
Yeah. No, I agree. Like, part of me is hopeful that they'll add some, some aspects from Diablo because I love Diablo. But if they do, I think it would just be Easter egg-ish, right?
Mm.
Like, very, sort of like a Warcraft base card, and then maybe in the background it'll have like an Easter egg from Diablo or an Easter egg from StarCraft, right? You'll see like a Baneling in the background or whatever. Oh. So I think that's true, but it is cool to just sort of talk about and just because of the sort of fun and whimsical nature of Hearthstone, that it is a possibility that they could bring this stuff in and you could have this weird clash, right?
Yeah, you could bring all that stuff. I mean, I want a siege tank. Who doesn't want to summon a minion siege tank?
Oh my gosh, AOE splash damage on the board.
Yeah, AOE splash damage. So good. StarCraft has a lot of these very distinct units, right? That can fit very well, and all these units have like abilities, and they're very iconic abilities too. The other thing with Diablo is that there's not a lot of iconic abilities. Like, what do you think of when you think of the wizard from Diablo 3?
Yeah, I mean, no, it's not. The iconic stuff from Diablo isn't going to be the playable characters. It's going to be like the primevals, right?
Right.
Or like Lazarus, or
Deckard Cain, the warrior.
Deckard Cain, Geed, right? Or Griswold, something like that. Oh, also, I can see them doing, giving a character like a paladin weapon called like Griswold's sword.
Yeah.
Right?
I can see that.
Yeah. I can definitely see that.
Yeah.
And I think that'll be the extent.
Wurt's leg. That's what I want.
new rogues have always wanted a new weapon. I think it'll just be a Cogmaster's wrench, except it will just
not trigger on anything.
Yeah, it won't trigger on anything. Wurt's leg, so good.
But yeah, there's stuff. Yeah, I do think Diablo does have like a wealth of weapons and like lore when it comes to, and like history when it comes to that kind of stuff, and that's something that like StarCraft doesn't. So when it comes to like gear and weapons, they've got it covered. But like Hearthstone doesn't have a lot of those. It's just weapons. Okay. Anyway, that's question from the goat. Question from the goat is brought to you by our patrons. Patreon.com/grinninggoat. Thank you guys so much for supporting us. And now we will move on to the deep fried meta / card good bad. We'll combine the two. So it's playability by mana is deep fried meta, and card good bad is Abyssal Enforcer. And it kind of links together. And I'll start with playability by mana here. Playability by mana. Playability means can you play the card? Like, if you have a card that says cleave, destroy 2, like deal 2 damage to 2 random minions, you cannot play that card unless there's 2 minions on the board. It's not even like you don't get a lot of value out of the card. Like, there's 2 levels of playability, right? One is like Kodo, Stampeding Kodo playability, which is you're not really getting a whole ton of value out of this thing if you're playing it without destroying an opponent minion. So you have to wait until they have something on the board with 2 attack or lower. So it's not really playable until then. But if you need to drop it and you need the tempo, you don't have much else to do, you do it, right? Like, everyone's played a Kodo that didn't hit anything before. It was not the end of the world. You were just a bit sad because you gave up, like, basically, like, 1.5 mana's worth of value. On the other hand, you can't play cleave. If your opponent has, like, a 2/2 minion on the board that you just really need to get rid of because it's about to hit your face and give your opponent a coin, just hypothetically, you can't use cleave to kill it. You're just not allowed to. You can't play the card. I'm just stressing it so much. It's literally unplayable.
This is about as deep as your Jade is Jade
Yes,
comment.
yes, but like you
Yes.
have to. People don't internalize how bad this thing is. That you
Yeah,
just
no,
can't play a card. This is not explosive shot where if you just need it to be 5 mana, deal 5 damage to something, it'll do that, right? It's not gonna do
right.
that. It's not like glowing. You can't highlight it. You can't bring it onto the. Nothing happens. Okay, so as awful as that seems, these cards are everywhere because these cards are any card with a mana cost greater than 1. They are all completely unplayable on so many of your turns. And that is incredibly bad. Like, they're just in your hand and they're not an option, and you have one less choice to make. And remember, the better player you are, the more this affects you because this affects playability, affects choice. And you only are a good player by your choices in Hearthstone. There's nothing else that makes you a good player. I know people think RNG makes you a good player, but really it's about the choices that you make with the cards in your hand and your board. Okay, so an unplayable card we've established is probably the worst thing ever for a good player. Now, think about when a card is unplayable. Let's say a normal game has an effective. I like to use the 12 turn analogy, the 12 turn standard, not an analogy, which is that an average game in an average meta goes about 12 turns before the game is decided. It can go way faster if you're a fast deck. It can go way slower if you're slow decking it slower, but like just on average, it's 12. So you could shift it forward or back, whatever your beliefs are, and however your playstyles generally are. But within, and I like the number because within 12 turns, you get 15 cards if you're going first, which is half your deck, right? It's like nice and I don't know, elegant. So in these 15 cards, let's say how many cards do you get into your hand by turn 4? It's 4 cards plus the 3 that you start with. That's 7, right? So you get about
That's good
half the
math.
cards.
I agree with that.
Yeah, so it's like half your cards. So half the time, you are going to get a card, any card that's above 5 mana, and it will just be like unplayable. It will just be a stupid card that's in your hand that's completely unplayable. Half the time that you see this card. That's horrible. Like, if it had a card and it had a text on it that says, this is unplayable in half of your turns, you would never pick that card. It's just such a bad card. Now, that's like a 5 mana card, right? Which is like kind of, that's like an Azure Drake. It's still okay. What happens if you're talking about a 7 or 8 mana card? At that point, because you're cutting into the few more turns of playability, like if it's a 9 mana card, it's unplayable like 75% of the time. That's like ridiculous. Like it's barely playable. So if you have a Kraken in your deck, it's barely playable. And the problem is not really that you have a Kraken, because if you have a Kraken, it's eventually playable, right? Like all these cards are eventually playable. But what happens when you have 2 Krakens? Now, remember, you only on average have like 3 or 4 cards in your hand at most, and they dwindle, right, as the turns get higher. So like around turn 7 or turn 8, you only have like 2 cards or 3 cards in your hand. And if one of them's a Kraken, then you have no choice but to play your other 2 cards. And then you're out. Now, if you have 2 Krakens, you're just screwed. Game's over. Like, if you have 2 Krakens in your hand in your opening hand because you just happen to draw them, you have lost the game.
This is bringing up some bad memories.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And why would you lose the game that way if you're a good player? If you start out the game with a 75% chance to win, and you're giving yourself whatever chance it is that you draw your 2 Krakens in your first 5 turns, you just lose the game. That's a huge, like, loss factor. That's horrible RNG, right? And you invited it upon yourself by drafting 2 Krakens. You didn't have to draft 2 Krakens. This is you saying, I am going to go with the RNG gods. And this is also why the better of a player you are, the more you want to avoid these situations. And the worse of a player you are, the less you care about it, because when you're getting screwed over, you're changing like 55% win rate to like 0, which is not as bad as changing 75% win rate to 0. It's still bad, but there's a difference.
Right.
So this is what I mean. And it's not that uncommon to get 2 Krakens in your first like 5-6 cards. It's not common, but you do see it enough times. And if your win rate's normally 75%, that's a huge loss of win rate. To change that to 0 for whatever percentage that is, right? Like, you'll lower your win rate of the deck by like 5 to 10% that way. So that's what I mean by playability by mana. And this has a huge effect, and it especially kicks in when your cards start going down, when you start playing multiple cards. which is usually like turn 5 you start playing multiple cards sometimes. Turn 6 you start playing multiple cards sometimes. Turn 7 you're probably playing multiple cards instead of a 7-drop. Depends on your deck, right? But generally speaking. And so to the extent, and so the later the cards go, the more it's bad for you to take multiple, multiple copies, or not even of the same card, but just of anything of similar mana costs. It just gets bad, and the more each turn gets delayed, the way worse it is. So like, 5 mana is generally okay-ish, but you're starting to think about it, right? 6 mana, you really got to pay some attention. 7 mana is kind of a line where you're just like, I don't want too many of these, because if I have like anything more than like 2 or 3, I'm like a bit uncomfortable because I know I'm entering the RNG lottery to get screwed by a very significant amount. And again, remember, these are exponentially bad for you, each additional card you add, because you have a much higher chance to get 2 of them in your hand. And the second card is what really kills you. The first card is bad, the second card is way worse in your hand. And if you're talking about 8 drops, you almost can't do it. And 9 mana cards, definitely no. There's one more wrinkle on this, which is for Warlock. Warlocks generally have very small cards, right? You generally want a lot of 1 mana cards for Warlock.
Because they can afford it.
Because you can afford it, because you can hero power at some point and get your cards back. So if you have these like 7 mana gigantic cards, and you have like 6 1-mana cards in your deck, what this basically means is sometime before turn 7, you're almost guaranteed to have to hero power twice. So sometime before turn 7, you're going, and remember, hero powering as a Warlock doesn't give you any tempo whatsoever on the board. So sometime before turn 7, you're like, in order to like just still have stuff to play and whatever, you're going to actually, as the Warlock, lose 4 tempo of mana. 4 tempo of mana is like missing your like 2-drop and part of your 3 and the throb, right? Like it's a ton of mana to just like lose when it comes to the tempo. So that's why 7 drops are kind of critically bad for the world. Like if you look at our tier list, I'm doing this this kind of discussion mostly because people kept complaining about like on Reddit about our tier list, especially in Warlock, and how like certain like really highly like high mana cards are rated low. They're actually rated pretty high because they're good, but they're rated generally low. Like Kraken is a 54, which is lower than a Yeti, at least lower than a Mech Yeti, I'm pretty sure. Well, actually no. Yes, it is 1 point lower than a Mech Yeti. And that seems weird because Kraken's a premium card and Mech Yeti is barely a premium card. But it's because this mana penalty is really high. And then they look at Abyssal Enforcer, which is rated a 69, which is 1 lower than Imp Gang Boss and the second highest common card in Warlock by like a mile, and is generally an auto pick in Warlock. And they're saying this is way too low. This card should be like a 120 because it is just that insanely good in game winning. And it is insanely good in game winning, but how many of these do you want in your deck? How many of these can you afford to have in your deck before they cause you to lose the game? Not that they don't help you win the game. They actively cause you to lose the game. Like, if you ever wonder why Abyssal Enforcer seems so good, it's because having one in your hand is what got you in that position to frickin' begin with, that you need to play an Abyssal Enforcer to catch back up. Because you have hero power twice before turn 7, because you've lost 4 tempo on the board, and Warlock doesn't have that many great tempo gaining ways. Like, you have like Soulfire and Power Overwhelming, and that's kind of the extent of your like tempo gains. So you're playing the Abyssal Enforcer, and you're like, oh, I killed all his stuff, I'm back on the board, huge swing, yeah, it's 3 damage to my face, but whatever, it's totally worth it. And it is. But you're only there because you had a 7 mana card on the board. And what's even worse, Abyssal Enforcer isn't even playable on turn 7 a lot of the times. It clears your own side of the board too, so it's a situational, Kodo-like card, not as bad as a Cleave, but it's a Cleave-like card until turn 7. And then it's a Kodo-like card every turn after that. Where you could play it, but you really do want to put it on like at least a semi-advantageous board. So you're at the point now where the Abyssal Enforcer may be unplayable till turn 9. Like, totally realistically. And it's just screwing you over and over again every single turn it's in your hand and you can't play it. which is many, many turns. Until eventually, you have lost so much tempo because you've had this stupid card in your hand that you can use Abyssal Enforcer and it'll help you get back in the game. So, it's only rated as high as it is. It should never even be rated that high if it wasn't so freakishly overpowered, right? Like for 7 mana. And it's actually very well designed to get you back from an anti-tempo position, which is what the situation that it puts you in. So it's like a really well designed card, and it fills its role very well. But especially with the offering bonus, you do not want to take too many of these cards. People ask how many Abyssal Enforcers is too much. 3 is too much. I have a flat line. Like, I will only take the third one if the other cards are total trash. Because you're a Warlock. You can tap for these kinds of things if you need them as outs. You can't play 3 because it damages your face too much. Like, you need a lot of heals and a lot of taunts to be able to afford 3 of these guys. 2 is okay because you want to be able to make sure you get these. But in a normal, not in a normal draft, but in many drafts, you get offered 3 of these easily, right? That's what makes Warlock so good. And so what I'm trying to get at is the first one's a 69 because you're going to take it over almost anything, right? That's why it's a 69. It's so powerful, so game-changing that you should still take it. But what about the second one? The second one's really not all that great. It's still a good card, but you're no longer in that like territory of I have to take this card the way the first one is. And it's, especially if you have other 7 drops or 8 drops or 9 drops, right? Like you don't want to screw yourself that way. Like what I see people do all the time is a huge mistake. Is they have a Kraken in their hand, they have a Bog Creeper in their deck. It's pick 15. It's Abyssal Enforcer versus like not even Imp Gang Boss versus like Soulfire, and they're like, oh, Abyssal Enforcer auto pick. No, not Abyssal Enforcer auto pick. Like you kind of want that Soulfire because your deck is not going in that direction. Abyssal Enforcer is a situational pick. Your first one's a lot less situational. And, you know, Abyssal Enforcer or Soulfire, when you have 2 large cards halfway through the game, is kind of up for discussion. But if you already have an Abyssal Enforcer on top of that, and it's your second Abyssal Enforcer, and it's halfway through the draft, and you also have a Bog Creeper and a North Sea Kraken, that's not a good card. It's like an average card. You'll take it, but in taking it, it's the same as like taking a huge RNG card, where you're like, I already have a great deck. Am I going to add this RNG to it, or am I not going to? Well, it depends on how much I expect to win. Right? If I don't expect to win that much, then maybe. But if I'm a really good player and this is a really good deck, this is just adding RNG that helps me lose. Like, this is a loss condition. That's my spiel about Abyssal Enforcer and why. And this is also triggered because I think I had a 12-win Warlock, in which I passed up 2 Abyssal Enforcers for like 2 drops. Like, just like Raptors. And like in halfway through the draft too, not even like at the very end when I'm desperate for 2 drops, and people were like, "What? Stop throwing the game!" And I'm like, "No. Trust me. By the end of this draft, you want this 2 drop way more than the Abyssal Enforcer." And sure enough, we ended up with like 2 Abyssal Enforcers anyway, and then the Abyssal Enforcers didn't do all that much in the whole run. Like 1 would have been more than enough, and 1 game we actually lost because we got 2 Abyssal Enforcers in our opening hand. I said, anyway, so that's my whole spiel about Abyssal Enforcers. It's not really about Abyssal Enforcers. It's actually about all cards that cost a lot of mana, especially in Warlock. But Abyssal Enforcer seems to be people's version of, but this is the exception to everything. It's not.
Right. And even when Abyssal Enforcer was announced, we were just like, wow, this card would be extremely overpowered in other classes. But for a class like Warlock, it's appropriate, right? Is it still really freakishly good? Yes, that's why it is like the 2nd rated card after Imp Gang Boss in Warlock, right? And I think people definitely should stand by. Like, if you think Abyssal Enforcer is better than Imp Gang Boss, I just think you're objectively wrong there. Like,
kind of close. Like the first one, if it's your last pick, you don't have either.
Yeah, that's true. Sorry.
Like, I would say like they're pretty close. And if you have your curve already, maybe you even take the Abyssal. But if it's your first pick, that's the point at which you want to like take a step back in this meta.
Right. So Abyssal Enforcer obviously really good, and part of the reason why it is still so high is because it actually has an effect on the board, right? And in today's meta, especially as well, like it's not just for Warlock, but especially for Warlock, I can't play any big minion that has no battle cry, right? And this is even when you are able to play it. Like if I see, for example, even something like a Force Tank Max, which is about as good as you're going to get for a big thing that doesn't do anything,
Force
right?
Tank
It just
Max and Warlock is a 45.
yeah.
Like, that's why how low Force Tank Max is. You want to compare a 2-drop? You know what 2-drop is a 45? You know what? I'll tell you the 2-drop that's a 43.
Like
This
what,
is
a Master Swordsmith or something?
no Master Swordsmith is really bad. Actually,
Okay.
Master Swordsmith is a 42.
Okay,
So
yeah,
it's
yeah,
even
right?
there, right? But I was going with Duskboar,
Right.
Like Master Swordsmith and Duskboar are a little bit worse than these. You know what's a little bit better than a Force Tank Max in a Warlock?
All right, what?
Cabal Geomancer and Narubar Weblord. Like,
Oh, dude, I definitely agree.
Right?
I so agree with that. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's Warlock. You can't put these giant things that do nothing out there.
Yeah, definitely. And look, obviously, you can find an example, you can find a draft in which I'm like, oh yeah, I definitely want to take the Force Tank.
Yeah.
But generally, yeah, I'll take the Cabal Geomancer. I'll take the Web Lord. Those are definitely better cards.
Again, it's driven by the hero power. You have unlimited, like, as long as you can put stuff on the board that your opponent has to clear rather than hit your face, like, you have unlimited cards. You have 15 more cards than the opponent.
Yep. So once again, people can listen to this and they can sort of just warp this into like, why are you guys hating on Abyssal? It's so great, it does a lot of stuff.
It's a 69 in a Warlock where it's the second
69
best class card.
We're saying it's the second best class card in the class. Like, how much better
commons.
do you want, right?
It's
Right.
1 point below Imp Gang Boss. It's the tied with Haunted Creeper. It's above Mistress of Mixtures and like Dark Peddler and like Dark Bomb and Doom Guard and Baw Creeper. It is below like Shadow Flame, Doom, and Implosion. But like I value Doom so freaking highly, and Implosion is, I try to discount as much for RNG as possible, but Implosion is just stupidly like over. It does too much.
Yep. So, it seems like we're trashing on it a lot. We obviously recognize it as a good card. The takeaway from this really should just be, not only for Warlock, but for all the other classes, you want to consider why, there should be an overall penalty, and why we sort of have a penalty on the tier list as well for big cards. And with that in mind, it's almost remarkable how high still a card like Kraken is, right? When in fact, a 9, like, people are just like, oh man, Kraken does so much. It has to do that much just to like survive, right? Like, just to be able for you to rationalize the pick. And the fact that we think of Kraken as still a pretty good card, right? It's not like the end all of cards, but
better than
still
average in Warlock.
Right. It reflects the fact that you're getting a lot of stats, and 4 damage immediately is huge, right? That's a ton. But it has to be that in order to be picked. Otherwise, like, you run up with like the Eldritch Horror problem, right? In which it has a really good stat distribution actually, but you can't play Eldritch Horror just because it doesn't even taunt, right? It's not even like a Bog Creeper that taunts. So taunt is like pseudo.
It's not even Force Tank Max. It doesn't even force your opponent to address the bubble, or else you get huge value out of it. Like Force Tank Max doesn't have a taunt, but like you're gonna get a ton of value out of it if they don't do at least something to it. Eldritch Horror doesn't even do that. Like, it's one step below like a big dumb thing.
Yep.
So if you remember Classic, the highest, like, Stormwind Champion was by far the best like 7 mana card, or above. And that's because it did something on the board the turn it came out, and it buffed your entire board and was very good if you had a board. And so it was one of the like premium, near premium kind of picks that you would get, and there was nothing behind it. Like, everything afterwards was like crap. Like, War Golem was like not pickable. And then eventually Blizzard's like, well, we want the game to go on a little longer. This is a little too aggro, especially after GVG. And so they released North Sea Kraken. And it was a huge success. And we called it as soon as I saw this card. I'm like, this is going to define the meta in addition to the Inspire mechanic. And it's going to slow the game down along with the Inspire mechanic. And that's exactly what happened, right? And then Bog Creeper came out. And we were immediately like, I mean, that was a pretty easy read, I think.
Bog Creeper came out with Cyclotron.
Yeah, with Cyclotron, yeah. And
yeah.
You're just like, well, these are big cards. They're playable because they do stuff on the board. And they're insane value for... They're such insane value, let me rephrase that, like Merp said, for their mana cost, that they can even be played. Like, and have it be good. So, like... Yeah, like, people look at 69 and it's an Abyssal Enforcer, and they go into some class like, I don't know, let's say Warrior, which is like one of the classes now of like insanely highly rated cards. And they're like, well, Warrior has literally like 12 cards rated higher than a 69. But Abyssal Enforcer is like better than all of them except like maybe Fiery War Axe and Fool's Bane. And in Warlock, it's just not. That's the thing.
Right. And if you were to somehow move Abyssal Enforcer to Warrior, I know you're drooling at this. I know you're drooling at this. Stop. I know you're drooling at this idea. Stop. It won't happen. But if it were to be moved to the Warrior, like what score would it have?
I don't know. Over 90. Definitely over 90. Probably over 100. I don't
like
know.
110, 120, like something like that.
Over 90, right? Probably over 100.
It's all about how it fits in the class. Yeah. So, sorry I mentioned that. That's way too exciting for you, I know. But yeah, so this is something I think people need to realize, and also it's a good reminder to look at the hidden costs of these cards, right? Because it's easy to remember the games in which you win with a card. It's hard to see that you lost with the card, right?
Or because you didn't have another card in its place and it's been in your hand for a while.
Yes.
Like that's the hard part to really realize. Because normally you think like, oh, I just got out-tempoed, or like he just played this weird combo. But he was only able to play the combo because he had the board. He's only had the board because you lacked a choice or you missed a drop or something. And all that could have been prevented if you just did not have this Abyssal Enforcer.
Yeah.
So, it's one of those subtle things where, like, I get it. Abyssal Enforcer almost always gets a ton of value, comes out, destroys your opponent. It single-handedly wins you games. And the way it single-handedly loses you games, like, this is the reverse Fel Reaver effect. The few games that a well-played Fel Reaver loses you, you're like, oh my god, Fel Reaver lost me the game. I don't have any more cards to draw. Clearly it was Fel Reaver's fault, which is true. But for
it will happen.
Yeah, it will happen. But for Abyssal Enforcer, when it loses you the game, it's not like Abyssal Enforcer raises his hand and said, like, hey, remember those 5 turns you couldn't play me? No, you're just like, well, I just couldn't do anything about it. Damn, he had me. No, Abyssal Enforcer was your problem.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so that's my Abyssal Enforcer rant. Also, we hadn't done an Abyssal Enforcer card good bad yet, which is kind of weird. To justify why it's good, I just felt like it's not needed to justify why it's good. You deal 3 damage to everything, and you get a 6/6 for 7 mana. Like mathematically, to like do that kind of stuff, you should be dealing 2 damage to everything, not 3. So it just gets like an extra damage to everything. And 3 is a low enough number that you can almost always throw like your board more or less entirely into your opponent's stuff, get the value out of it, and then clear everything, right? Like, so it works even if you have like sort of a board. As long as you're fighting for the board, this thing works.
Yeah.
The problem is if you're actually ahead on the board, then you can't play it. So there is a strategy to play against the Warlock, which is to make sure the Warlock stays on the board. Which is a weird thing to do to a Warlock, but if you have like a control-ish deck, as long as you keep the Warlock somewhat on the board compared to your minions, you can stall the game indefinitely. Because the Warlock can't play the power card, Abyssal Enforcer. And you'll force him to do like weird tap things or whatever. And so then hopefully when you do clear, in the same turn that you flip the board, he can't flip it back, and then you get lethal very quickly. Like, that is one way to deal with the Warlock. But you need like the right deck and the right cards in your hand.
Yeah. All right. So I think that's a good talk. Now let's move on to everyone's favorite class, and the class that we're going to be playing this week, the Priest.
So I haven't played a single Priest run in all of 2017.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I've done a few. Look, Priest is one of those classes in which, and we've talked about it before, so we don't have to go in depth here, but very draft dependent, right? And also, you got to survive the early turns. And what MSG has done is it has given Priest a blowout mechanic. It's given them an absolute blowout mechanic in the form of Cabal Talon Priest, right?
Yep.
If you have a 2-drop that is up, and then you can transition into Cabal Talon Priest, you pretty much just win the game right there.
Yep.
Because a lot of times it'll just be like, you kill their 2-drop, and for 3 mana, what do you have on the board now? Like a 3/4 and a 3/2, something like that, maybe? Yep. Or like a 3/4 and like a 2/3 or something.
Let's just call it what it is. It's an Argent Protector in the early game that gives you a regular-sized body for his mana cost. Like, it's stupid.
Pretty much.
But then again, that's what Priest does. That's what like Shrinkmeister is, right? It's
Yeah.
but the problem with Shriekmeister is that it's turn 2, so you actually need the coin to do anything with it. But
Right.
like this is turn 3, so you don't even need the coin. It's a
Right.
stupid card. It was always a stupid card. It's still a stupid card. No one's doubting its stupidness.
Right. And also,
Can you tell that I don't like this card?
also Potion of Madness. Oh my gosh, that card in the early game and even in the late game, just very frustrating.
Yep.
Right. That is the one card because going into turn 3, like Cabal Talent Priest, I can think of like on turn 3, just remove their stuff, or like I can think about that. The Potion of Madness.
It's so hard to play around.
It's hard to play around because a lot of times it's so sort of like if you don't play around it, you hurt yourself a lot.
And you can't afford to against the priest. You need that tempo to kill his next thing, or else he starts
Right.
buffing it like crazy.
Exactly. But if you play into it, him using 1 mana to do it's too punishing.
It's a horrible card. It's a horribly
Right.
designed card.
Because
like, if this was like an arena, they're actually rebalancing things for arena. You know, it should be 2 mana instead of 1. Potion of
What?
freaking madness.
yeah, it should. So that's the problem because you've never had go into turn 3 in Cabal Talent Priest. You've done the same thing, right? It doesn't change your traditional move against the priest,
Yep.
which means as long as it doesn't change the way you used to play, it's not that big of an effect.
Yep.
But with Potion of Madness, it changes how you play. For example, because you used to coin out a 2/3 and then play like a 3/2 as an example, basic move, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now you're just thinking, you're just like, God, I could just get totally destroyed by this very standard play that I would make against the priest, typically, right?
Yep.
And then you're just like, I don't know if I can afford this because he would have eaten up 2 of my cards and the coin for just 1 mana and a card.
You're boxed out. You're completely boxed out of your options.
Yeah.
And imagine if you had a Haunted Creeper. You lose the game now.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh.
It doesn't even
yeah.
matter if you don't have a good target for the Haunted Creeper to run into. You still just lose the game.
Right.
If you're a hunter and you play the grandmother, you're dead.
Yep.
You lose.
And as if you're player 2, for example, do you not coin out the 2 into a 2?
Of
you
course
need
you
that.
Do. You do. You always
you
do.
Need that.
The problem is that there's no counterplay.
Right.
There's no real counterplay in the arena for this kind of stuff. And certain cards are just dead cards now. It's the Gurubashi effect in Classic, right? Where you can't play Gurubashi because there weren't that many cards, and so everyone had a Kodo. And so if they drew their Kodo and they had it in their hand and you played a Gurubashi, you lose the game. That was a very board-centric. There's not a lot of big swings, so you just lose the game. You never come back from your Gurubashi being Kodoed. Doesn't matter how good of a player you are. Doesn't matter how many good cards you have. As long as they're not throwing the game, you lose. So it's that same effect, except it happens on any turn. You don't even have to wait till turn 5, right? The playability issue. And on top of that, this card has a freaking offering bonus. And it's the highest rated card in Priest. So people are gonna take it. It's such a poorly designed card.
Let's hope we get a lot of them.
Well, but that's the thing. It's not that good to get a lot of them because it is still situational, right?
I'll still take it, man. Would you not? Would you not take it? I'm like, I guess
I would take Talon
for
Priest over
tank.
Potion of Madness after the first one.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, we're talking about pretty good cards here.
Yeah. But I would even take Shadow or Death, or maybe even Mind Control.
Okay, I mean we're talking about really good cards here.
But I'm saying it is super premium to have one of them.
Yeah.
But the second one, it can start having a similar effect as having 2 cleaves or whatever, right? It's just stuck in your hand. Yes, using it to remove even a 2 attack minion is good, but they still need to have that on the board, and they need something for you to run it into, right? So they need 2 minions, and one of them has to be 2 attack. It's not even cleave; it's even more situational than cleave. So you don't want too many of these in your deck. But having 1 or 2 in your deck is game changing. So we're back in the Abyssal Enforcer levels of stuff here, right?
Yep.
That's Potion of Madness.
All right.
Yeah.
That's
and if you're
for you.
wondering, and I know people are and it's oh, so why is Abyssal Enforcer if you're describing them the same way, why is Abyssal Enforcer at 69 and Potion of Madness at 80? Well, one, Abyssal Enforcer is guaranteed to have 7 turns of nothingness, whereas Potion of Madness, if you draw it, every turn could be a way to trigger. And 2, Abyssal Enforcer is actually much better than the Kraken than Potion of Madness is than the Kraken. Because in Priest, The difference between Potion of Madness and North Sea Kraken is 12 points, but in Warlock, it's 15. So if you look at relatively, Potion of Madness is not as good in Priest when compared to other large cards like the Kraken as Abyssal Enforcer is to Warlock.
It's all relative.
So it's all relative.
Yeah.
You're right. Abyssal Enforcer is better than Potion of Madness in that sense if you're looking to fill the spot of a big card-ish. But the problem is Warlock has fewer of those spots and they get more punishing. So you have other options. Like, you want 2-drops way more as a Warlock than the Priest. And that comes at a cost. That cost is a spot in your deck, which pushes out other cards.
Yep.
Whereas as a Priest, like 1-mana temple cards are generally fine. You don't generally have too many of those. Okay. That's our Lightforge. We'll see. Oh, next week we're getting Victor, also known as 12 Wins, also known as Dota 2 MMR boosting. Number 1 EU with over 9 wins per run. It's like 9.3 or something like that on the January leaderboards. And we'll talk to him about, like, because that's like the definition of like destroying the meta when you're like, oh, like he beat Crypt by like a win and a half.
Right. Different servers, but
yeah.
I mean, he if we're talking about like strict
EU, he beat the next guy by like half a win too. Right?
Something like that.
Like, but that's a half a win. You go down from Crypt's average last month to like down half a win, and you're at like I wasn't even trying average, right? Like playing like random classes average. Half a win is huge.
Half a win is, and it becomes bigger once you're that high.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It gets exponentially harder the higher your win rate is to move it up by even 0.1 or 0.2. So we'll talk to him about how he did that and where he thinks the meta is, and all that good stuff.
Yep. Alrighty. That is that. Thank you guys for listening. Can't wait to get Victor on next week. I guess I'll do the outro this time. Until next time, this is Merps.
This is ADWCTA.
See you guys.